Ask all these things. In your name we pray. Amen. Have you ever thought about how amazing you are? Have you ever thought about that? Every day you wake up, and how many days do you have to be concerned about your heart beating? How many days? Like, can you really do anything about that? How many days do you wake up and you put your legs on the floor and you get up? Have you thought about that? Like, there's not you just get up. Like, you tell your brain, I want to get up, you get up. How many times when you go through life do you have to be extremely worried about blinking? Does that ever really just bother you? Like, what happens if I don't blink anymore, right? Like, what happens if my legs don't stand up? And the amazing thing is that these are all so important. Like, they're important for life, but we really don't have very much control over them. And when all of that's working together, you know what we feel? Happiness. Happiness. Like, when you can blink, when you can get up, when you can move, and there's no aches, there's no pains, there's no heart suffering there. it's it is wonderful. It is paramount that all that work together painless for us to really be happy. And even though there's like all this stuff in our life, we got, eyes and legs and fingers and all this stuff, there is this one other section of our life and that really makes a difference on how we feel. And that is our soul, that is our spirit, that is our heart. And the most amazing thing is when our soul and our heart are not feeling the greatest, when they're broken into 1,000 different pieces, it also is the craziest thing in the world, but it affects our physical life and how we feel. And the thing about hearts is that we trust them with a lot of people. We trust them with a lot of objects. We trust them with a lot of treasures, a lot of hobbies and interests. But what I would like to tell you this morning is that God, the good news is that God only makes happy hearts. That's it. God only makes happy hearts. So, what that should tell you and me is that when our hearts are broken and not happy, there's a problem. And oftentimes, you and I, we go throughout our life from the time we are 3 years old and we have our favorite toy, and some horrible person on the neighborhood block steals it from us, to the time, we're 45 and we're at work and somebody shows us up at work that they're better than us. Like, all our life, we just leave this trail of brokenness here. And so the question is, how do we get away from that? Because if you haven't checked lately, people are everywhere. Everywhere. So can't get away from people. And we can't get away from sickness, illness, because I don't know if you check, but it happens, right? Like, we can't get away from limited means of provision. Like, how many of us have a bank account and it just grows money, right? Like, all you got to do is take it out and it just keeps growing. Probably none of us, right? Nobody in the world. And so we have to understand that there is a solution, there's a source to this joy, and there is a way to make our hearts happy. And it takes a little focus and it takes trusting in the Lord, but it's possible. And so, if you would turn with me today to chapter 2, Judges chapter 2, verse 8. And as you're turning there, when you hear the name of this book, it sounds really bad. Like, who wants to read a book called Judges? Like, I love to read a good judgment story about judging my life and how horrible I am and all this kind of stuff. But the craziest thing in the world is the entire book is about some people being absolutely horrible people, but it's about God saving people. Now, if that doesn't make your heart happy, then I don't know if I can help you. Like, that's good news. And so if you turn with me to Judges chapter 2, verse 8, it says this: Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. That whole generation was also gathered to their ancestors. After them, another generation rose up who did not know the Lord or the works he had done for Israel. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They worshiped the Baals and abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed other gods from the surrounding peoples and bowed down to them. They angered the Lord, for they abandoned him and worshipped Baal and the Ashtoreths. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he handed them over to marauders who raided them. He sold them to the enemies around them, and they could no longer resist their enemies. And so, as we look at this situation, we find that Israel had really gotten through all the hard, difficult days. And God had given them the promised land and what he had promised. Now, what happened is this cycle that often happens in our life. And Israel, when they were standing on the very border of the promised land, and they saw all these warriors, all these walls, everything, here's where their mindset was: we need God. Like, we need God to step in our place and fight for us. And guess what? God did that. And time after time, they won. They had victory. They didn't lose people. It was great. It was wonderful. But then it comes to the point to where all of it's done, and God gives them the promised land. They receive their inheritance, and it's all wonderful. It's great for that generation. And then you have another generation that comes up, and they're good folks too. Like, they worship the Lord, they do all this. But then we have this other generation that comes up. And if you know anything about generations, they're different. Like, they are vastly different. Like, you take a 80-something-year-old person and you take a 20-something-year-old person, and I mean, it's almost like they are speaking a different language. Like, it's like different languages completely. And so we have this issue here to where, for some reason, this generation decided to go off the tracks. That was their choice. Now, why in the world would that happen, right? Well, I think if we go back and ask ourselves the question why, it has a lot to do with the experiences of every generation. Because even though all these generations, like, I'm not going to sit up here and tell you that they was all perfect generations. Just like every generation that we have today is not perfect. But one thing the first generation had that this third generation did not have is that they literally experienced God fighting for them. Like, they were there when they was marching around the walls of Jericho and blew the trumpet and the walls fall down. Now, you take that experience, and then you take an experience where you already have your house, you already have your land. You they tell you these stories, right? And those stories are good and true, but for some reason they couldn't put their faith and trust in what they were being told. And if you notice here, really Joshua dies, and this generation dies, and this whole new generation comes, and and the book of Judges words it as they forgot about God. Now, that's a strange thing to say. Like, you can forget your keys, you can forget your wallet, maybe. You forget, you maybe forget your house keys. Maybe one time you forgot your child in the car. I don't know. But to forget God, that seems like very difficult, because, like, he's so great, so wonderful. I mean, He is the reason why they have everything nice that they have. But here's what we oftentimes forget, and what Israel experienced is that there's no better way for the enemy to corrupt the soul than nice things and good days. That's pretty much the best way to do it. And that's what happened with this generation. Uh, they looked out and they experienced blessing beyond measure, and they forgot the reason they had these things were not because they were geniuses. It wasn't because they were military strategists, because they had all these warriors. It wasn't because they were business savvy. It was none of these reasons, but it was because God had allowed it to happen because of their love for Him, and they were His people, and He was their God. And so they forgot about that. And they allowed the blessing to take precedence over the one who gave the blessing. And what happens when you do that is what nobody likes: one hit wonders. Nobody likes a one hit wonder, because when you got a one hit wonder, you don't have one hit. Like, that's the one thing you're known for the rest of your life. And the only income you're getting is from that. And so they were loving this blessing. They had it up on their mantle. They loved the promised land. They just thought about how much they loved it, but they ignored the way they got it. And when you do that, that sets up your life to be that one hit wonder, that one time that is good. And what happens is, and this is what that generation did, they sat around for the rest of their lives talking about how great it was. And then they died. That's pretty much what happened. And so you have to realize that this generation, they were people. And you know what people do? They make their own decisions. And sometimes they're horrible decisions. But people are also a product of the people around them, the people they raise. Now, we are going to confess that sometimes you try to raise kids the right way and they still turn out like horrible people. Like, it happens. God raises us up, and look at some of the stuff that we do. But the reality is that this generation's father and mother and grandmother and everybody in the community were responsible for doing their part to bringing these people up to remember God. And somewhere down the line, somewhere in the communication, it got lost and they forgot God. And the thing about forgetting God is, you don't just wake up one day and you forget about God. It doesn't happen that way. And if you were to go back in Israel's journey, they would do these actions, okay? So like when something really great happened, they wanted to memorialize it, right? Like they want to remember, which is great. So they get some rocks and they put them up, a pile of rocks, and they say, hey, to this day, this is going to be a sign of God's great deliverance. Well, that's to them. What you have to do is you have to translate to the next generation what those rocks mean. Because if this generation is walking along the border, the river, or wherever, and they see this big pile of rocks, what are they going to think? Well, that's strange. Who would pile up a big bunch of rocks? Whereas this generation before is thinking, well, they should know better. Like, they grew up in the promised land. Like, that, they should know that. But they didn't know that. And somewhere in one of many ways, they forgot about God. And the reality is that you can forget about God. And if you're someone who doesn't know God and is not in a relationship with God, it's bad. But when you forget about God, when you are in a relationship with Him, when you know Him, He's going to come for you. And here's the deal. That sounds horrible. Like, He's going to come for you and get you. But He's going to come for you and He's going to get you because He absolutely wants the best for you in your life. Like, He wants you to live a purpose-driven life to where you are the most satisfied and to have the most joy. And the one place that you can find that is in this three-letter word called God. And the reality is that they forgot about God, so they began to look around. And I promise you, there was some great stuff in the promised land. Some great stuff, like grapes the size of men, grape bunches the size of men. You got milk and honey going everywhere. You got land that you just say, hey, I want this big pot of land here, and just a life that was the most fulfilling that you had ever experienced. But the problem is that all that creation was good, but it pointed to the greatness of a creator. And they traded in creation, they traded in the creator for creation. And here's what happens when you do that. Not good, not good. Because creation can do limited things, and God can do unlimited things. And when you try to do something with limits, bad things happen. Because as they ate them grapes, you know what happens after you eat a good bowl of grapes? You get hungry again, right? Like what happens? What happens after you build this really nice house and a storm comes through and it just blows it all away? You have to build another house, right? Like all this involves change and multiple reasons why it should not be where our heart is set upon. But it happens. It happens. And so oftentimes in our life, we think about God. We say, oh, God is great, God is wonderful, and He is. And we have to understand and realize that we have to put our trust in Him alone. We have to set our heart upon Him. And oftentimes we agree that murder is bad. I mean, y'all probably agree with that, right? Like murder is a bad thing. It causes a lot of struggles and pain and judgment. And adultery is bad. That's horrible. Like, breaking that covenant in a marriage. And there's a long list of things that we consider bad and dangerous. So most of us we don't touch them. It's pretty simple. Like, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't do this, and we don't do it. But see, the enemy knows that there is more than one way to get someone to forget about God. And the most effective way that the enemy knows to make us forget about God and forsake God is to cause us to get caught up in all the blessings of life, all the things that God gives us. And these things are not bad. Family is not bad. Church is not bad. Traditions are not bad. Money in itself is not bad. Wanting a good relationship is not bad. Like the list goes on and on and on. Wanting a good career, not bad. All this stuff. But the reality is that oftentimes we, like the children of Israel in this generation, see, is we make an agreement to trade in the one way that we're going to find purpose and fulfillment in our lives in relationship to God and our love for Him for something that does not talk back. It doesn't talk back. When you think about all the money, all the time, all the heart that we pour into creation, it's mind-boggling. And honestly, they don't even care. Like, I'm going to confess, I may spend a little bit on fishing stuff, right? And here's the reality. Those fish, they get away and they go and they never come back. And it doesn't matter how committed I am to them, they are not committed to me. And that is just like anything in this world. It is not it doesn't matter how much money we give, how much time we give, how much heart we give. And so God has a design. And if you're like me, designs are good, but sometimes you don't like the design. Because when you say the word design, it has limitations. That means you don't go over here and you don't go over here and you don't go over. You got to stay within this line. So God creates happy hearts. He does. When we become a Christian, and that's the thing, when we get saved and we become a Christian, our heart is happy, it's wonderful, it's alive. And the reason it's alive and it's happy is because we are in a right relationship to God. We realize that knowing God and giving him ourselves up for him has been and is the most joyous experience of our lives for multiple reasons. Some being that when we give our time, when we give our treasures, when we give everything, we get stuff back. And it's not always monetary, but the reality is that God gives eternal pleasure and he gives eternal joy. But what we do is we take this design that God has and we take our money and our time and our treasures and we think, well, we're just going to have joint custody. You know what I'm saying? Like we'll just take our happy heart and we'll just peel off a little piece, okay? We'll peel off a little piece and then we're going to give that to our favorite hobby, okay? So we'll just throw it over there to the favorite hobby, give it to there. So what do we have now? We're missing something, right? But we got a little pleasure out of that hobby. So guess what happens? We need a little more. Just just a little more. Okay, so we give it a little more, but then we say, well, you know what? I would be so happy if I had a great job and they actually respected me. Like I know none of y'all have ever had a bad day at work, right? Never, never. Well, here's the secret. Everybody has a bad day at work, and we always think there's something better out there. So we say, well, I'm going to find this job and I'm going to give it my all, give it my everything, my heart, my time, my treasures, everything. And I'm going to give it a piece of my heart and it's going to get better, right? Well, all of a sudden, it's like salt. It just makes you thirstier and thirstier and thirstier. And so it doesn't work out there. So then you got to take a little more piece of your heart and it's like, got to find the solution to this. So you say, well, you know what? I just need the perfect family. Like, that's what I need. Maybe if we go to enough counseling, if I read enough books, if I recommend to my spouse enough books, like it's going to happen because family is where it's at, which family is good. But so he's like, I'm going to give some of my heart to them. So then, all of a sudden, I don't know if you notice, but this is not a happy heart anymore. It's not. And the reality is that all this stuff does give you pleasure, but it expires. And it brings an emptiness that leaves you wanting more. Whereas God completes you. And so this process goes on and on and on until like we don't have nothing left. A great example is also we love to eat. I love to eat. You know what I'm saying? Like, there is nothing better than when you're down and you've had the worst day of your life than to call upon Bluebell. There's just nothing better, right? But here's the reality. Bluebell, you get to the bottom of the bowl, right? And you're still in the same place you was. You just have more sugar and maybe a little fatter. So you give your heart away to them, and all of a sudden God's plan, which was way cheaper than all that, which costs less time, less energy, everything, and you was happy, and then now you've given it all up for something that just is stealing from you. So when you're in this condition, God has a solution. He has a solution. Because when you and I are in this condition, in which this morning you have to ask yourselves the question, you may say, well, I haven't forgotten about God. I go to church every Sunday. I got my Bible. I read about him. He's there. But you have to ask yourselves the question, where is your heart at? And the way you know that is, this is real easy. Where do you put your money? Where do you put your time? And where do you put your importance of things at? And right now, if you don't have a happy heart, the easiest thing in the world is all you have to do is rearrange it. Rearrange it. I'm not saying you have to get rid of everything you like in life, but what God is saying is that, like, I gave up my son for you. I killed my son. He's your savior. Like, if you just trust me, you will have a happy heart. So then God goes on to say that in verse 14, the Lord's anger burned against Israel. That does not sound good. You got angry and then you got really angry. And most of the time, it's okay, like, if the lady at the dollar store is angry at you. You know, it's okay if your kids are angry at you because you're the parent and you take control. But when God is angry at you, that's not good because God controls the weather, He controls your provision, He controls your mercy, your grace, everything. He can actually, right now, He is controlling every blessing that is in your life, allowing it not to fall apart and explode into a million different pieces. And so God was angry at Israel, and all of a sudden He took His hand of protection off of Israel. And you know what happened? You would not believe how quick they fell down. It's like the very instance God took His hand off, they fell, destroyed, gone, disappeared. So you know what that caused is like cause and effect. It caused groaning. Have you ever seen anybody that groans? You know some groaners. Well, so Israel had everything. They forgot that the secret to having everything was God. So then God had to do some surgery. And when we think about pain, oftentimes we always assume that pain is bad. Pain is bad. It's uncomfortable. It's no good. But we have to realize that some pain is great. Like, how many of us went to the doctor, had surgery? Well, at its core, surgery is somebody cutting you open, taking something out of you, and sewing it back together. That doesn't sound good, but it's wonderful because when that surgeon is done and it's over with and everything heals, guess what? You feel better. Now, if your child or some man on the street was to try to do surgery, you know what would happen? You would die. You would die. It would not be good. So God was doing surgery. He was causing pain so that they could experience the greater blessing of knowing God than anything that was great in the promised land. And so He had to get them to that place where they said, Lord, I need some help. I need some help. And most of the time, people who have everything don't like to ask for help and they feel like they don't need any help. So God had to do it for them. And when God did it for them, they began to groan and they all of a sudden, wow, it's like they remembered God. And they began, probably in their mind, they began to think about, all my family who died used to tell me the story about a great God, a great Savior, a great Lord. And He parted the Red Seas. And all they did was walk around some walls and they fell down. So maybe we ought to reach out and see if He can do. So the great news about this is that God is one who responds to our groaning. And as you see here, they groaned. And in verse 15, whenever the Israelites went out, the Lord was against them, and He brought disaster on them, just as He had promised and sworn to them. So they suffered greatly. The Lord raised up judges who saved them from the power of their marauders. But they did not listen to their judges. Instead, they prostituted themselves with other gods, bowing down to them. They quickly turned from the way of their fathers, who had walked in obedience to the Lord's commands. They did not do as their fathers did. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for the Israelites, the Lord was with him and saved the people from the power of their enemies while the judge was still alive. The Lord was moved to pity whenever they groaned because of those who were oppressing and afflicting them. Now, see here, this is the best news in the world. Because these people were guilty. Guilty. And it's easy to find grace and a little pity for someone who's innocent or someone who didn't really mean to do what they did. But Israel was guilty as they come. And God reached out His hand to bring them back to where they needed to be. And Israel groaned. They called out to God. And you're never going to believe. He answered them. He answered them. Like, what? We wouldn't do that. Like, we block people on Facebook and don't answer their phone calls for way less than that. But God did not block them out, but he responded to their pain and their suffering and their groaning. And he responded in a strange way because as you see here, he knew that they weren't going to get any better. I mean, we know that. If he knew that they was going to get better, here's what he would have done. He wouldn't have created judges. That's not what he would have done. So it tells us God's strategy here was to raise up a judge. Now that sounds simple. That's like only 4 or 5 words. But that's like 10, 15 years. In all reality, have you ever raised a child? How long does it take for them to get to maturity? For some of us, it was longer, but it takes a while. It takes a while. And so God, they groaned, God heard them, and God answered them. But the answer looked like it wasn't coming, but God was in the process of doing it, raising up a judge. And when he did, here's what these judges did. They fought for Israel. They fought for Israel. They fought their battles. They were God's symbol of protection here. And so we have to realize in our life is that just like Israel, we can't do it. We cannot do that. And the good news is that God knows we can't. God knows we can't. There are tons of religions around the world, and they are just as moralistic as we are. They agree that it's good to be committed to your husband and your wife, that it is good not to murder someone, that it's good to obey your parents. But the problem is, with all those other situations, they expect people to do it on their own. And you know how frustrating that is? I don't know if you've ever tried, but just try to be good for one day. Today, starting right now, you heard my sermon. I want you to be good for the rest of the day. And it ain't going to happen. But here's the reality, that we give our hearts away, and it's disappeared. It's gone into nothing. So, see, in order for God to bring us back to where we need to be, see, we can't just put a Band-Aid on it, right? Like we just can't add on something. But the way that God changes lives is that through this process, he molds us and he makes us and he gives us a brand new heart. A brand new heart. And you know what the great things about brand new is? They don't have the trappings of the old. They don't. And so you and I have to look at our lives and ask ourselves the question this morning, do we have a happy heart? And you may say, well, Brother Matthew, you don't know my health issues, or you don't know the husband or wife that I got to live with, or you don't know the provision that is lacking in my bank account, or you don't know the sin that I've committed that is so horrible. Well, the reality is that all those things are probably still going to be there next week when I come back to church. So what you and I have to realize is that the answer is not getting rid of all that stuff because you're not going to do it. But the answer is attaching your heart to the one who created you, to put in your trust in him. And the great thing about Jesus is that he doesn't expire. He has enough mercy to cover you. Like, he's not like some insurance companies who, when you have a wreck or you have some kind of strange occurrence, they say, oh, that was not in the policy. Well, here's the reality. Like in Jesus's policy, any sort of broken heart is covered and he can make it happy. But all we have to do is to believe him and realize that we can enjoy all the things of life, but we can't set our heart on those things of life. It's just like this. It's like you may shop at the dollar store. You may shop at Academy. You may spend money at Walmart, which we all do, but you don't bank at the dollar store. Because if you left all your money at the dollar store, I'm telling you right now, it would be gone. If you left all your money at Walmart, just sitting there on the aisle, a little jar said, hey, this is Matthew's bank account, do not touch, it would be gone. So we can enjoy the things of life, but we can't set our hearts on these things. Because every time we do, it'll be broken in half. And so this morning, as we have this invitation, as Jackson comes forward, I just ask you to ask yourself the question, do you have a happy heart? And if you don't, and if you feel like it's broken in a million pieces, to realize that the answer is to simply stop giving over your life, your time, your treasures, everything to all these pursuits in life that are not going to fulfill, and to turn your heart towards Christ, to admit that you're fallen, to believe that Jesus died on the cross and rose again, and to allow him to be in charge in your life. And then you won't be missing out on anything, but you experience so much greater pleasure.